You have a combination of more EVs like we talked about. We talked about AI, crypto, but EVs is a big wild card. And then you also touched on shutting down of plants, which is why, capacity auctions 3 years from now are freaking out and doubling and tripling, because they're saying, okay, plants are shutting down and we don't have enough generation to meet those plants, let alone, enough for the added load on the grid.
There's no alternative sources of energy, and you just start shutting down the coal-fired plants, and you bring in energy from other locations. It's more expensive to transport that energy. Here in Maryland, my electric rate has increased over 50% in 5 years.
This transition period is going to be painful unless we can get more generation facilities on the grid and get them on quickly.
Welcome to In the Loop with Larry. This is our May 2025 edition. And in this edition, we're going to talk about electric rates and where they're heading, why they're skyrocketing right now, and everything you need to know about electric rates in the market that we're in this environment. So Larry, welcome.
Thank you.
Why don't you explain to us first, Larry, what are capacity auctions? What do they mean, and what do people need to know about them?
Yeah, so one of the things that utilities make sure that they do is that they look far ahead in advance, several years in advance, and make sure that they have enough facilities to make electricity to match the rising demand. So one of the challenges right now, Warren, is there's a pretty significant expectation for rising demand over the next couple of years. So an RTO, which is a regional transmission organization, will look at several states. So they're typically over several states. Like, for example, PJM is here in the kind of like the mid-Atlantic Northeast area, multiple states, including Pennsylvania, where we're at here. They look about 2 to 3 years in advance, and they make sure that they have enough generation capacity at that point to produce the estimated generation that's going to be needed then, plus a margin, because utilities can never afford not having enough generation. You can have a little bit extra, but you cannot ever not have enough.
Right.
And so what they do is they run this auction, and power generators submit bids based on the amount of capacity that they offer to go towards that demand at that time. So they bid, they say, hey, we're going to have 100 megawatts in 3 years from now, or whatever it might be. They place their bid. The auction accepts the lowest bids first to keep it competitive until the total capacity that's needed is met. And at that point, then the highest accepted or highest cleared bid sets the market clearing price for all of those generating facilities, which is then paid to all the resources that cleared the auction, regardless of their individual bid amounts. So it might seem a little bit convoluted, but again, the point is to just confirm that we're going to have the capacity that we need in 3 years from now, and that the market is giving the right pricing suggestion to these generation facilities so that they're responding appropriately.
So how does that trickle down to ratepayers? Once these RTOs, they set their price, they come to an agreement, they've got the highest price, that's the one it's going to be. How does that affect ratepayers and our electric rate at the end of the day?
Yeah, so it's not quite a direct correlation. So we're seeing these capacity auctions double and or triple from what we typically were used to seeing in the past. It doesn't mean that our electric rates are going to double or triple in the next 3 years, but it will affect it, because while capacity payments are not tied to actual generation of the electricity, they're payments made for those facilities being available. So we're going to guarantee you a certain amount of money just so that you're available if we need your production during times of peak demand. So when at any given point in time, the utility is going to get electricity from the cheapest source first, and then it's going to work its way up and get more electricity from more expensive sources as it needs to. So some of these facilities that are being built and that won that auction may or may not produce electricity a lot of the time. They might be idling a lot of the time unless they're needed for high demand times. but they're guaranteed payments for being available, not necessarily for producing electricity. So most of our costs come from producing the actual electricity itself,
Right.
but then our costs are affected by these higher rates for these generators that are needed just to be available for high peak demand time. So for example, here in PJM region, the capacity auction cleared at probably between doubled and tripled of typical, and our electricity rates have gone up about 17% as a result. So that shows you a little bit of the correlation.
Sure. What are some of the drivers for usage?
So there's a number of drivers, and some of these are a little bit unknown yet. So one is AI and data centers.
Yeah.
That's a big driver right now. Like, how much electricity is AI going to need? Where are these data centers going to be? There's a lot of them going in already. So that's a huge one right now, Warren. That's getting a lot of discussion. Another one is crypto. That's a smaller one overall, but you could have pretty significant, pretty large facilities to produce crypto. And then finally, EVs is a big one, which I think you're seeing a lot of that in Maryland right now, Warren.
We are. You know, Maryland followed the California law of moving towards really zero emissions with EV vehicles by 2035. And I know just last week the current administration was able to put a stop to what's happening in California. Maryland, we have modeled that legislation essentially, and what was scheduled to happen is that by 2035, all new sales of electric vehicles would be electric or zero emission vehicles, and it was scheduled to start kicking in 2027, beginning of 2027. Recently, however, Governor Moore just signed a executive order delaying that, pushing it back to 2029. So automakers will not be penalized until 2029 if they don't start meeting the requirements, and it steps up each year, additional requirements year after year on the number of vehicles that need to have zero emissions. And so that has been pushed back, and part of the reason it's been pushed back in Maryland has over the last several years taken a very clean energy approach, not well thought out, thank you, Maryland, which has contributed to a lot of our skyrocketing prices already in shutting down as many coal-fired existing plants that we have. And we're now down to one plant, this Brandon Shores plant in Anne Arundel County, just south of Baltimore. It's the last remaining coal-fired plant in Maryland, scheduled to shut down here in June of this year, 2025. However, PJM has stepped in and asked them and said that until they complete this $1.5 billion package of grid upgrades, they can't afford to have that plant shut down. So it's going to remain open, it appears, until 2029 as well. So we've got a few extra years of our last remaining coal-fired plant here. The challenge being in Maryland, and this is probably consistent with a lot of states, when if there's no alternative sources of energy and you just start shutting down the coal-fired plants and you bring in energy from other locations, it's more expensive to transport that energy long distances, increased distribution fees. It just gets more expensive, and all of that gets passed on to the ratepayer. And we've seen that here in Maryland. My electric rate has increased over 50% in 5 years, and it doesn't seem like there's any end in sight or any relief for that. And Maryland, according to some new legislation that was passed in this session, is really heading in the direction of nuclear, which is great. But as we know, even with cutting red tape and getting rid of regulations, it's probably going to take, Larry, 5, 10, 15 years to build nuclear plants, get them operational, and get them working. So we have some real headwinds when it comes to electric rates here in Maryland. And if we continue to put more EVs with more demand on the grid, on the road, that's going to just exacerbate those challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. What you're seeing there in Maryland is significant, and I think it's similar to what we're going to see really everywhere in the future, because you have a combination of more EVs, like we talked about. We talked about AI, crypto, but EVs is a big wild card. When is that going to be required? How soon will that be? You know, everyone has an EV. How quickly will that transition happen? I think is a big question mark. And then you also touched on shutting down of plants, which is why, capacity auctions 3 years from now are freaking out and
Yeah.
doubling and tripling because they're saying, okay, plants are shutting down and we don't have enough generation to meet those plants, let alone, enough for the added load on the grid.
And we also are transitioning, I think, to an era where things are becoming battery operated. Lawnmowers,
Mm-hmm.
blowers, snow blowers. And they might be small loads, but the aggregate of all of these electric loads, including an EV and all of your battery powered things that you're charging at home, are adding to the load. So you have that in combination with the crypto and the AI and the data centers, and there's just going to be
Yeah.
a massive need for electricity. It's hard to see rates going down in the near future.
Yep, yep, agreed. And the other thing that is becoming more popular is the all electric home. Where your
Yeah.
HVAC is now all electric as opposed to gas or oil or the other sources that we were
Stoves,
used to in the
every
past.
yes.
Yep, yep. So it's certainly a combination of things. Personally, I welcome it because I think electricity can be a very efficient and very cost effective way to run everything from cars to HVAC to you name it. But this transition period is going to be painful unless we can get more generation facilities on the grid and get them on quickly.
Yeah, I agree. The transition is going to be challenging. It needs to be well thought out. Probably won't. There'll be hiccups along the way as well as expenses that go along with that. So we'll see. We'll see where we end up.
Yep, and I think solar has a big part to play with that, Warren. We're going to install as many systems as we can to do our part to help out the generation squeeze that's coming.
Absolutely. And to help people save money. If your electric rates are going up and you use a fair amount of electricity and you have tax liability, you should look into solar. Well, thanks, Larry. I mean, that's not exciting news. I think the summary of what we've talked about is electric rates are going up for a variety of different reasons. It doesn't look like there's any relief in sight. You can mitigate that with solar, but we're going to have some challenges getting everything electrified.